Welcome to episode 36 of the Trainer's Bullpen, Scenario-Based Training and the Pedagogical Shift with Dr. Chris Cushion. Professor Chris Cushion discusses the transformation of police personal safety training using scenario-based training, emphasizing the need for a pedagogical shift and the integration of decision-making and skill acquisition within tactical contexts. He addresses the challenges of implementing change and the disparity between the traditional training models and the gold standard of scenario-based training. The conversation delves into the importance of implicit learning, the flaws of front-loading skills, and the need for contextualized practice. The role of instructors in coaching through scenarios and the limitations of traditional debriefs are also highlighted. Professor Chris Cushion discusses the transformation of police personal safety training using scenario-based training and highlights the challenges, the evidence, and the impact of the new approach. Dr. Cushion also addresses the cultural and political dilemmas in implementing change and the adoption of the new training model by the College of Policing in England and Wales. And today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Professor Chris Cushion. Professor Cushion is a professor of coaching and pedagogy at Loughborough University. His interests focus on understanding coach learning and education, coaching practice, and coach behavior across a range of practice and performance settings. The aim of this understanding is to contribute to developing learning environments primarily for where an element of performance under pressure is an outcome. This includes end users and those tasked with teaching, training, instructing, and coaching, including design, delivery, and evaluation. Chris has published 3 books and has over 100 publications in this area. As well as having a strong academic grounding, he has extensive experience working as a coach, instructor, and head of coaching. He has worked on several projects with sport governing bodies and with professional sport organizations. This work extends into non-sporting context, working on coaching and coach education, training, and train the trainer. This includes developing new curriculum and training packages for officer safety in the police and embedding coaching approaches to training and train the trainer with the military. Professor Cushion, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen, and thanks for making the time to join us today.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read with great interest recently your paper entitled Changing Police Personal Safety Training Using Scenario-Based Training, a critical analysis of the dilemmas of practice impacting change. And I know we're going to talk a lot about what you put forward in this paper and the implications of it and the discussion issue. But Dr. Cushion or Professor Cushion, why don't we start with, I know you've been working in this area with police in the UK for a long time. So what was sort of the background for this particular study or the genesis that caused you to write this paper?
Yeah, so I mean, it's almost a happy accident. So one of my coaching interests is I'm a jiu-jitsu instructor and coach. And back in about 2014 or 2015, so almost 10 years ago, I noticed that there were a number of contact professionals, if you will, including police officers who were coming to do sessions, coming to do training. And my academic curiosity kind of said, well, you know, you're in this job where you have to encounter difficult situations and difficult people. Why are you here? And essentially, the answer was we don't really think that our training's adequate. So we're taking it upon ourselves to engage in additional training. And that really sparked some questions in me about, okay, well, what's going on in those sorts of training environments? So I'm an ethnographer by trade. So that means I immerse myself in particular cultures and in particular environments and try and understand them. So I basically signed up to do the training. So I did police officer safety training. I did training in security. I did training in secure mental health environments, just to understand the type of training environments that were being created, what the learner experience was, and really try to get under the skin of the training culture in these spaces and answer the question, you know, why is it that these folks, as part of their job, are getting training but feel that they need to get additional support or need to do something extra? And falling out of that was a review paper. So I did specifically around police training. So I published that paper in 2016. It came out online, and then hard copy in 2018, which basically reviewed the state of officer safety training, so empty hand training, really, so arrest and self-defense techniques in England and Wales. So we looked at time on task, we looked at the learner journey through the course, and I was a learner on several courses myself. And basically, it was a very 45% of the time officers were standing around, either observing somebody or listening to somebody tell them a war story about their experience. It was very skill drill oriented. So it was a set of techniques that were just drilled over and over again, and they were delivered out of context. So for example, handcuffing on the floor, you literally with the partner laid on the floor and you put the handcuffs on them, and that was handcuffing on the floor. No consideration of how the person got on the floor and why they might have been there and what happens if they wriggle or put their hands under that. There was no consideration of that. So it's very skill and technique driven. The instructors were very skilled and very committed, but very stuck in that kind of skills first, instructor-led paradigm. And scenarios were part of the training, but they were always at the end. So if we had time, we'd do a scenario which was at 100 miles an hour and incredibly risky, and really just as almost a sense check for the instructors that the people could do it. So it was more about a testing of learning, but then really, what we understand about learning now is it's really a test of performance, isn't it? Because you don't learn much in a couple of hours. It takes ages for that stuff to be embedded. So can I practice it under a little bit of pressure? Yeah, kind of. So the scenarios weren't used as a learning device as such. They were just used as a testing device at the end. So I published that piece of work, and serendipity, really. The College of Policing, who are the professional body for policing in England and Wales, got in touch with me and basically said, we're looking to do a review of officer safety training. We've seen the paper, we've seen the research, can you help us? So that was the start of my relationship with the College of Policing. And from there, it's like, let's look at what's happening. We know what existing training is happening. How do we think about this in a different way? And I look at it in a very different way to the ways that they'd been looking at it before. So we worked with the College of Policing to develop a new curriculum, a train the package. And really, it was in that process, I guess, between 2018 and 2022, when the paper came out, where I started to look at, kind of get stuck in the space of like, how do we implement change? How do we move training into a different place? How do we change the training culture, the mentality of the officers and the people delivering the training, really? And the dilemmas paper was really a reflection of my experiences of trying to implement change, but also drawing on a literature. And there's a body of work looking at scenario-based training in the military and in the police from around the world and there's some very similar messages around when you try and go from one type of training to another, what the issues come to. So, really at the time, it was a reflection of, the challenges of trying to shift the dial on the training culture and the trainer work, and getting to people to think a little bit differently about training police officers.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction. And now when you use the term, I guess we should sort of define things for our listeners, because you're using scenario-based training, or SBT, in your research. And I can already hear our listeners, very experienced trainers, going, yeah, this is nothing new to me. I've used scenario-based training for 20 years. But but that's not what we typically see in a law enforcement environment. Is a long period of static linear type of skill or technique based training, and then you said, there's this compressed period of highly complex, high fidelity scenario. But that's not what you mean when you're talking about scenario based training. So can you maybe discuss the differences about that?
I would say that pretty much every police trainer that I've encountered, when we start talking about scenario-based training, that everyone says, well, we already do that. And you're right, you already do it, but not in the format. So this is really it's a pedagogical model. So it's basically the boat that carries all of the learning. So scenario-based training is the vehicle for training. So it isn't a skills-first approach. There aren't any other things, and it's not at the end. All of the training is enveloped in a scenario. And essentially what that means is and you go from radio call to resolution. So you get called to an incident and there's a resolution, whatever that is. The subject's under control or under restrained and under arrest, whatever it is. And you basically snip at those two pieces, you pick that up and you drop it into the training room. And that is the scenario. So it could be stop and search. It could be dealing with aggressive person. It could be a drunken disorderly, whatever it is. So you have radio call to resolution, and that is the vehicle for the training. So what typically happens in scenario-based training, as perhaps your listeners' understanding is, it's the full thing at full speed. So authentic scenario-based training in this case is it's radio call for resolution, but what we do is we then modify the task. So the task is modified to the level and the standard of the learner, whether it's a new officer, beginning officer, whether it's an experienced officer with particular issues, or if you want to explore particular elements of a scenario. So every scenario is modified, and we use modification principles. And basically, you can modify threat level, so it can be very, very low resistance or no resistance, all the way up to assaultative, this person's not going to stop or really want to hurt you. So there's 6 levels in use of force in England and Wales. They talk about level 1 to 6, 1 being basically this person agrees with everything you say and will do anything you tell them, versus the person is continuously assaulting you and wanting to hurt you and arguably kill you. So you've got the 6 levels, but we've also got intensity and speed. So we've got level 1 to level 10. We don't go past the 6 without gear. So you're talking again about a 1 to 6. So you can have high threat level, low speed. So somebody with an edged weapon who is very high threat level 5 or 6, but can be doing this at a speed of 1 or 2. So you can start manipulating the speed, and then you can also look at how complex or not this is. So the number of subjects, the number of moving parts, the environment. So you start manipulating and essentially modifying the task to start shaping the learning environment. So all the learning happens inside the scenario. So for example, if this is a stop and search and you decide that you want to handcuff, so you might have an approach, and but this also meshes in the verbal stuff as well. So verbal de-escalation and talking to people. So you might approach the subject and start speaking to them, and it's a stop and search there, whatever it is, and you get to a point where this person is demonstrating some issue where they may be a risk, and you want to put them in handcuffs. Right. Well, we've got a skill required now, haven't we? And we can start how compliant is the person going to be? How resistant are they going to be to handcuffing? Now, at that point, we talk about handcuffing. Right. We don't block handcuffing and then think about wanting to use it. So decision making and skill are always coupled, essentially. So we get to a point where in a stop and search, I want to put handcuffs on this person. Now I need the skill of handcuffing. Okay. So we can work on handcuffing because the decision making, the skill is connected. And when you're working with new officers, or you're trying to introduce new skills and new techniques, the understanding of when this needs to happen and why is clear. So one thing that I've learned over the years, and an important part of scenario-based training, is individuals need to take personal meaning or personal understanding from things. So I can show a million videos, I can tell people a million times, at this point you need to do this. But until they have that personal understanding and ownership of that, so they have that level of understanding, it doesn't have meaning. And meaning is really powerful for learning. So essentially, we work through levels of the scenario, increasingly complex versions of the whole, manipulating the conditions and bringing out different things that we want to work on. So in this case, we've gone up to somebody, we've spoken to them, we've decided there's a level of risk, so we want to put handcuffs on. Let's talk about that technique of handcuffing. Now this person might start being resistant and say, well, no, I'm not. No, you're not putting handcuffs on me. So now we have to combine control and then handcuffing. And so we start layering in the complexity. And then an important part of this is that the instruction becomes quite personalized. So you then, as an instructor, you can see who's struggling with what, who's good at what, and you can start challenging or supporting the learners as they work through the different levels and as they work through different things. So, there may be a particular type of handcuffing that somebody's struggling with. So you condition it so you can do every type of handcuff you like, but you can only work on this one, i.e. the thing that they're struggling with, so they get more practice at it. So you can start playing with the dials and personalizing the learning. So you could have a set of officers doing the same scenario, but all working on different things according to their needs. So as you can see, this is a lot more than just doing stuff at the end. This is the vehicle that carries all of the learning. And again, in England, we've got some interesting stuff around the law, around when can I restrain somebody in a stop and search. There's some stuff around this legislation and law. So we might ask the person about their powers and what legal powers they're using. So again, you can start stirring in the content knowledge and checking and challenging the officers where they are in terms of their powers and what laws they're operating on. And that works across all the different scenarios. So basically, radio call to resolution, increasingly complex versions of the whole, manipulate conditions to bring out the learning that you want, and start adding in the different things. So nothing's front loaded. It all happens when it happens. And we teach it according to when it's needed and when it happens, rather than prioritizing anything. So a key part of this is that, as I say, the decision making and the skill are always coupled. So people know when they're doing it, why they're doing it, they understand what's needed. And that's a really, really important aspect, because a lot of the problems around use of force are around decision making, right? I've gone too soon, I've gone too late. And then if I've gone too soon or too late, there's compensation about what force I use and how I use it. So the decision-making element is really, really important. And also, of course, you're meshing this with the verbal skills, so de-escalation. So every aspect has an element of talking to the subject. You have to talk to the subject around what you want them to do, whether you want to de-escalate, what you want to go next. So all of that is meshed together. So none of these parts are trained separately. They all happen, and it basically, the scenario is the vehicle for training to happen.
Okay, that's a great overview of that. I have a couple of comments is just on top of that. So, one of the things I think, I do hear pushback on a model like this from a lot of use of force trainers is this idea we're stuck in a model of needing to build fundamentals before we add context. And I hear that, Professor, repeatedly from trainers, is we just have this bias of, they'll say, okay, when it comes to, ground fighting or handcuffing or whatever the skill is, that we need to build a base of fundamental skills before we start adding context. And you're vigorously nodding your head no. So
I'm shaking my head. Yeah.
Okay, so push back on that. If a trainer was to say that,
I think that is a bias, and I think if we think about, so that traditional model, so our perceptions are framed by our experiences or our understanding. So we have the very behaviorally based model of instruction, which basically disintegrated the skill, the task from the environment, and then broke the task up into lots of little bits and get lots of repetitions and then put it back together. And we're asking the learner then to carry, to do a lot of the work, make a lot of the connections. So we do this stuff. And so the echo of that just runs through police training for me. There's, it's incredibly powerful and incredibly difficult to challenge. So in terms of the amount of time that you would spend, there's no difference here. So you and I could get a group of officers and we're going to do some kind of control technique and some handcuffing, and we could spend an hour on it, front loading it before we throw people into scenarios. I would still spend an hour on those things if that's what those officers needed, but I would do it when they needed it. So there comes a point when they need it. So for me, the technique is important, but the decision making is is the problem. If you look at the evidence around problems with use of force, it's the underlying decision making and understanding. And I think in scenario based training, we've got two elements. We've got scenario appreciation, and a scenario understanding. And again, you can't do this without contextualized practice. And the skill really is useless without it. So scenario appreciation is, what is this person trying to do? So are they trying to assault you? Are they trying to get away? What do you see what this person's trying to do with you or to you? So there's an appreciation piece and there's an understanding piece. And the understanding piece is, what is the solution? So if this person is assaulting me and trying to hurt me versus this person is trying to get away from me, the solution or skill might be different. What I need to do might be different. It might be the same. I might need to protect myself first and then do something. But there's an appreciation of what's happening, and then the solution to it will be different. And the solution then is, well, I need this skill. Well, let's pause there. Let's practice the crap out of this skill, and then let's put it back in the scenario. But that operant attention, the idea and understanding of when and why I'm doing something is absolutely clear. And I don't have to explain it. I don't have to explain it. It implicitly happens. People recognize this person's trying to do this, so therefore my response should be that. And I, as an instructor or a coach, don't need to tell the officer that, because they've worked through it in a scenario. They don't need to think about the decision-making piece. So for me, I don't think it's spending any less time working on those fundamentals, because yes, you need to have a level of skill to be able to do something, to do a technique. You need to make it happen. It's just when you do it. So I'm sorry, but I don't think you do need to front load it. You need to insert it when people need it. That's the way to do it, because that way the decision making is inbuilt. You don't have to keep telling, at this point you need to do this to this person. On the street, you're not going to be there tapping them on the shoulder and saying, this person is trying to do this. You realize that. And so you need to do this now. So that if you build it into the training, it's called sampling, basically. So the learners implicitly realize what I need to do, because it's been baked into the scenario and the training process. So for me, I think this approach, we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. Yes, people need to be skillful. They need to have a grasp of whatever it is they're learning. It's just when are we doing it and why? And for me, like I say, drilling stuff in a linear fashion and then having a scenario at 100 miles an hour at the end is so hit and miss. And we're so relying on the learners to do a lot of the work, when we can actually build scenarios and training to do the work for us, so that the officers build this implicit understanding. They don't have to be told that this is the thing to do at this moment, because they've just done it over and over again in practice and they understand that. So I think it's flawed. I think it's fundamentally flawed that we need to front load skills. I really do. Even more, after however many years doing this, I'm even more convinced it's flawed.
Right. I would agree with you. I had the opportunity a few years ago to take some training from Dr. Joan Vickers on decision training, and she used a phrase that I always remember. She talked about technique within tactics, and the whole concept there is that any skill acquisition, any skill movement or technique always needs to be coupled with contextual, tactical relevance. And I think that's exactly what I'm hearing you saying, is even right at the very beginning with brand new learners, is set the context so they understand the connection between the real world and why am I actually learning this skill and how do I apply it.
I mean, we have an interesting example, so increasingly in England and Wales and the UK, mental health calls, vulnerable people are an increasing part of the workload. Okay, so you could be called to a vulnerable person. They could have mental health problems. They could have Alzheimer's. There could be an elderly person with Alzheimer's who's assaulting somebody, right? So these things happen. But the person grabbing your arm or wrist, if it's somebody having a mental health crisis or is someone who's elderly and has Alzheimer's, is very different to somebody grabbing your arm and wrist who's posting you ready to punch you, right? So the response is very different. So if I just teach the techniques in isolation, if someone grabs you here, here's a technique, and here's a list of people that you need to use it with, and here's this technique here, and here's a list of people you need to use it with. I mean, that just makes no sense to me, right? Whereas if you build the scenario, you've got somebody who's aggressive, assaultative, who's likely, who's got a record of violence against police, is likely to assault you. When they grab you, it's for a reason, and this technique is probably going to be the right thing. If it's a vulnerable person or an elderly person who is grabbing onto you in having a crisis, it's a very different approach. It's a very different tactical answer, isn't it? But I don't have to tell people that. So you don't have to end up saying, well, this technique works when you're working with this person, and this technique works when you're working in this, and you need to deploy this skill in this environment. Who's going to remember that? It needs to be implicitly in the practice design. It needs to be implicitly in the scenario, so people understand, the decision making and the skill go together, basically.
Right. No, that's a great point. And I think, when you think of law enforcement on the street, no call, no situation that an officer goes to is going to be exactly going to replicate any training environment. And so, adaptability, the motor learning adaptability to the real world, and that decision-making piece that you stressed, I think is so important. If we understand that that's our goal at the end of training, is to have highly resilient, adaptable, professional decision makers, then we, reverse engineer.
What you're looking for is for that kind of skills and tactical solutions really can be transferred, but without the instructor having to tell the officer, right? So it's not instructor led. That decision making is not instructor led. It's context and scenario led. So if you build the practice design and model it, people suddenly realize when this person in this situation does this, I've got a bank of tactics or skills that I can use. I don't have to be told what to do. It happens implicitly, right? So let's not get in the way of people's implicit kind of processes by them turning around. So this person's grabbing me. Let me just turn to my instructor and just check with you. What should I do here? I mean, that's essentially what the training. Some current training models do. They basically make you very instructor dependent. You're getting a bank of skills, but really, and told when to use it. And if you're not sure, you then say, well, actually, what should I do here? But if it's baked in, if it's part of the scenario and part of the decision-making process, it becomes more powerful. And it's interesting that implicit, research around implicit learning is really interesting in quick decision-making, high pressure spaces. People who've learned these things implicitly are more likely to make good decisions than those who've been told stuff, who've learned it explicitly. So again, it really suits the environment that we're working in. Those kind of high pressure, quick decisions need to be made. Use of force decisions really line up with that more implicit learning model, i.e. we're not telling people what to do all the time. They're implicitly getting the information from the environment, from the context, and making good decisions. Now, the beauty of scenario-based training, of course, is that we can, the training room, we can pause, we can rewind, and we can say, are you sure? You want to have another go at that? Let's have a look at that. So again, the beauty of scenario-based training is that we can train through the scenario, so we can manipulate the task, the environment, the learner, and we can exaggerate and emphasize different things. But also that doesn't make me as an instructor redundant. So I can pause stuff and say, let pause. I think you're making a poor decision. Just talk me through what you're doing. Let's rewind it. What would be a better decision here? And if the officer looks at you blank, then show them something, right? Well, how about this? Or have you thought about this? Let me show you something. And then that's when your more traditional skill type practice comes. If it's something new, so, well, let's just step out. Let's do a few reps of that to get a sense of where you're at. And then let's put you back in the scenario and you can have a go at that. And as you work through the repetitions of the scenario, that becomes embedded and you get those things in there. So that, that kind of focusing and enhancing, the instructor is able to do that. And again, we're asking the skill of the instructor here to start reading the scenario and reading the decision. So we're still instructors and coaches. We can still intervene and we can still offer our experience. But again, we do it all inside the scenario package. It's not a debrief. It's not front loading information. It's all as stuff is happening. So it's all connected. And people talk about operant attention. When I'm attending to something, I'm more likely to want feedback and more likely to receive learn from the feedback I'm being given. So the intervention. So if it's happening alongside the issue that's in front of me, I'm more likely to want that feedback, and it's more likely to impact my next attempt in my learning, rather than it being a debrief 20 minutes or an hour later and where we just talk about stuff. You might as well not bother with that, really, if from a learning perspective, because it's not going to make any difference.
Right. And I think that's often what we see at the conclusion of scenarios is a 20-minute debrief, expecting that our students will actually remember even a fraction of what we're talking about, rather than at the time when it's happening, pausing it while it's real, while it's meaningful, and then having a conversation about where they're at right now within context.
Well, for me, the debrief is, so I mean, I'll give you a recent example. So I observed some training, and it was an officer. So the scenario was the domestic situation. So the call was there's disturbance in a home. Go and basically sort it out. Go and find out what's going on and sort it out. So you can work through different scenarios in here, but one of them was one of the people in the house has an edged weapon and doesn't like the cops. And as soon as the door opens, they come out with the knife. Right, they're trying to hurt the police officer with the knife. Okay, so the officer is completely taken. The first rep is completely taken by surprise by this, and they would have been Swiss cheese. Basically, they would have been stabbed multiple times. They eventually got some distance, and we don't have firearms in England, so they got some use parva or spray, pepper spray. Basically, created some distance and got some spray off, and eventually dealt with it. But that initial shock, they would have been caught several times with the knife. Okay. The difficulty that for me is a teachable moment straight away. Okay, let's talk about what's happened. Let's rewind it. Let's walk through it a few times. Let's give you some options. Why are you so close to the front door? Let's talk about distance. So there's lots of things that you can do tactically here, but that particular instructor waited until the debrief, right? And the debrief was, and again, they talked through all the options, but the classic for me is you've created a training scar now. So this person now they've not practiced the solution. They've just been told because under no pressure, everyone will go, what would you do? Well, I'll just do this. But under pressure, that's not what you do. What you do is what you do, right? It isn't the perfect answer. So for me, one of the issues around, the debriefs are too long for a start. You end up describing what just happened, and it provides some solution, but just telling somebody something is pretty meaningless, in terms of instruction. And for me, if you're going to do those sorts of debriefs, you need to build a little bit of time and say, well, let's just go back. Let's just walk back and let's talk. Let's do it again, essentially. Give you a chance to practice some success. Let's give you some confidence and competence. I mean, we're in the business of building confidence and developing competence. So people believe that they can do it and they can actually do it. And very often the way that we structure our training, when we let the mistakes go, don't intervene at the time, and then debrief without really giving an opportunity for someone to practice, we're starting to erode confidence and making people feel less competent about it. Basically through, by just telling people, well, next time you should just do that. And it's like, well, okay, easy for you to say, but let's not practice it. So for me, it's, if you're going to do those debriefs, shorter and leave a bit of time to revisit some practical stuff. Better still, just do it to coach in the scenario, deal with it as it happens, basically, and give people an opportunity to practice and rebuild their confidence and competence so they're equipped to deal with the problems that they're facing. And basically we're just giving people training scars, right? This is a scar when I messed this up, and it didn't go very well. I didn't really get a solution. I didn't really get an opportunity to practice the right thing. And that person now is going to be, subconsciously or consciously be worried about that situation next time they face it.
Right, exactly. So with what you're saying about this whole scenario-based training approach, and the scenario-based training is really, it's the boat that carries all the learning. I love that analogy. So if this is the gold standard, Professor, of really rich motor learning for police officers and having highly adaptable, great decision makers in the field, Why is there such? What is your experience on, like, we have such a huge disparity between what you've just presented and the way law enforcement training currently exists? I'm
Yeah.
sure in the UK as well as in here in North America. So why is that? And then what's the avenue for solutions to making it
Yeah.
better?
Yeah. I mean, so I mean, in the paper we talk about conceptual, pedagogical, social, cultural, and political. So there's the four levels. There's how people understand learning, really, the conceptual piece, how they deliver their practice. There's the kind of local level of what's expected in the culture, and then there's the broader policy piece. So we talk about those four levels and how they all have to be aligned. So I think I'm very fortunate in England. The College of Policing as that kind of professional body are the policy makers. And so they've got the kind of top down, this, we are changing this, we know it needs to be better. But we've also got people like me involved, and there's a significant body of instructors who want to develop the training. So we've got the ground up. So we're kind of tackling these layers from the top and from the bottom. But I'm not underestimating how difficult it is. And what I found in recent years is it's basically a triple loop. Okay. So the first loop is recognizing that what you're doing might not be the most contemporary, the most evidence informed, or the most up to date. Okay, so that for me is a massive piece. Some kind of self-awareness and acceptance. Nobody sets out to do a bad job, right? So everybody was trained and learned to do what they thought was the best thing that they could do. They're working in a way that they think is great for their learners, but that self-awareness piece, that kind of injection of reflection and thinking about where the training, how effective is the training? Is this really informed by up-to-date ideas and principles? So that first loop is getting trainers particularly to accept that they're in a space that could be better. And that's a massive, massive challenge.
Okay, so I just want to kind of double tap on that, Professor, because I think that's an important principle. I'm just going to read something from your paper here. You say that the current traditional model of police training is a behavioral militaristic model of training rooted in obsolete, counterproductive practices long ago abandoned by educators and other occupational professional communities. That is recognizable in the United Kingdom and internationally. It's a training model that arguably does not develop perception, judgment, decision-making, critical thinking, or competence. Now, what evidence would you bring to a trainer? Like, so say I'm heavily entrenched in this generational petri dish of technique-based, linear type of training. What evidence would you bring to me to go, hey, Chris, what you're doing is not working? How would you convince me of that?
Okay, I mean, I've been living that for the last few years. So I think it's a multi-pronged piece. So I'm very much about analysing what instructors do. So we spend a lot of time looking at time on task. What are the learners spending their time doing? What activities are they doing? And what's the learner journey through your training, Chris? So let's look at that first. Let's look at what the evidence tells us about performance versus learning. So what's good for performance and what's good for learning in terms of practice design and how those things connect. And I think for me, it's once people kind of understand that difference between, what is learning, so long-term retention and transfer, what is performance, being able to repeat something after a brief period of skill. And then you blend in the data there's a lot of use of force data, and there's a lot of feedback from officers about what they use and what they find effective. So we've got the time on task, we've got performance versus learning, we've got reviewing your practice. Let's look at what the officers are spending their time doing. Let's look at what the data tells us. Let's look at what our contemporary ideas around practice design to develop learning versus practice that gives us great performance, illusions of competence. So there's that conceptual piece, but the biggest change for me has been bringing officers onto the train the trainer upskill and showing them something different. So I spent a lot of time with PowerPoints and videos and papers and evidence, and it was all pretty much meh, so yeah, but what we're still doing is great. The biggest change for me is when we bring existing trainers into a space and show them what we mean. So this is what a scenario-based training looks like. This is how you put the skill. This is where we go. This is how you do it. So as soon as you've seen this, I would say 90% of trainers go, yeah, okay, I get this. So the evidence about use of force, the evidence about what officers are doing, the evidence around performance versus learning and the type of what we need to do to create a learning environment, and then something different, showing them something different. All of that together is stuff that's started the dominoes starting to go. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still trainers who don't like this, who will we could use US vernacular, but we could be selling, we could be offering $10 bills for $1 and they still wouldn't buy them. So regardless of what we said and do, they would just not take that on board. And as an outsider, that's kind of not my problem. That's for
Right.
that's for the administration and the respective forces to deal with that. But in the main, the written evidence, the examples, the data, plus showing them something different. What does this training look and feel like? Is the thing that makes the massive difference. And then, of course, when they then in a supportive environment try it with their officers, and the feedback they get from their officers is like, wow, this is amazing. This is the best training I've done in 20 years. That feeds the flames. So for me, it's almost scenario-based conversion. You have to put them in the scenario for them to understand what the training looks like and what it means and what the difference can make. And I'm really lucky that the College of Policing and the paper should be out any time. Started to look at a comparison between the more traditional training and the new training, and looked at data. So officer injuries, use of force, complaints, subject injuries, and I mean, if I'd have paid them, I couldn't have got better data. So the data is just unbelievably good around the impact of the new training. So again, all of these things start kind of moving the dial, But for me, the thing that I've learned over the last 4 or 5 years is you can talk to people until you're blue in the face, but you need to get them in a training room and you need to show them stuff and say, look, this is what this looks like. Let me show you how it works. And that's the thing that's really changed people's perceptions, I think.
Absolutely. And I like how you said it earlier that, trainers, they are such a passionate, dedicated group of men and women who train law enforcement. And they're not using an ineffective model because they want to make ineffective people.
Correct.
They actually genuinely believe that what they're doing is having the
Correct.
desirable results. And I think, as if we all have the same goal in mind, and that is our passion is our people. It's making the best police officers, the most professional police officers on the street. It's to optimize public safety. And if that's all our goal, then, this model that you're talking about here, this pedagogical scenario-based approach should be one that once you understand it is readily embraced by
Yeah.
trainers. And if there's those rare trainers like you mentioned that no matter, I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said a man convinced against his will holds the same opinion still. There's just,
Yeah.
if we have those trainers that absolutely just refuse to explore and approach and adopt this way, then the issue is we have the wrong people as trainers because it's about them and not about their people.
I mean, it's really challenging. It's really challenging because there are folks who know a lot of stuff, who've got a lot of experience, but again, it's not a baby in the bathwater. It's how you share that with people. So we talk. I work with trainers quite a lot. You've got some amazing stories around use of force and some situations, and I just say to them, just turn it into something in the training. So don't sit people down and talk the story. Put them in the scenario and walk through it with them. Show stuff. Get them doing stuff. So you can still use your experience, but you just put it into a different format. rather than just telling stories about this or that, or that this happened or that happened. Well, let's set it up. Let's do it. Let's work it and see how people deal with it. So for me, and I think one of the trainers I work with called it, weaponizing the war story. Basically, you need to turn it into a practice. So rather than it just being a story, this is a practice, and you're going to go. The worst day of my life as a police officer, when I had to deal with this person, we're going to do it again, and you're going to see how you get on, and we'll talk about the options and the mistakes that I made and what I might do differently, and suddenly all the stuff that you need, skills, techniques, coaching, all come in, but they're all inside that scenario piece. And I think that for me, the loop is recognizing that what you're doing is suboptimal, accepting that there's a different model, whether that's a scenario-based driven or an ecological, whatever it is, whatever that approach is, but a more, it's more task-based, isn't it? Increasing complex, all of that stuff, more contextualized practice. And the final loop is getting good at delivering scenario-based training because it asks completely different questions. I call it, we're re-skilling the trainer. I think that training cadre have been professionally de-skilled over the years. I think they just get a list of techniques that they just work through the list. People show, I show you a technique, you show it me back, tick, all great. Have a big bust up at the end. Yeah, that's another great course. And for me, I think those guys have, it's a professional disservice to them. They've been professionally de-skilled. Whereas now they can use their imagination, they can draw on the experience in the room, they can devise scenarios, they can work with individual people, they can use that experience in a much more interesting and positive way. And I think this sort of training is about professionally re-skilling that training workforce, really. And we've done our best over the last 10 or 15 years to de-skill them by making everything about lists and tick boxing and standardized and linear. With the greatest respect, we could drag anybody off the street to do that. What's the point? These people are skilled professionals. Let's maximize their knowledge and understanding and getting them doing, training that's much more rewarding, that's better for the learner. And I think for me, it's always been about that kind of professional re-skilling of that trainer workforce. And again, 80 or 90% of them will love it. But there's a little core of people who maybe don't and maybe need to rethink their options, right?
Right.
But for me, we've done our best to de-skill trainers, I think. Or the system has done its best to de-skill trainers.
Right. Okay. So that you were talking about the conceptual and sort of pedagogical dilemmas as the approach there and helping trainers understand a different way of approaching this scenario-based training. So in your paper, you had a couple of other dilemmas or barriers. I don't know. Is that appropriate? Like you say, dilemma, and a way I read the
dilemmas
paper,
of practice, aren't they? They're just things that you need to think about dealing with. So they may or may not be a barrier, but they're things that come up that affect the way that, I call it a social press. They press against what you're able to do or not do. So I like that framework, the dilemmas, because they are dilemmas, right? We have to sit and think about how we deal with this and how we overcome the press of these different things, for sure.
Absolutely. So you also mentioned cultural and political dilemmas. Yeah. So do you want to talk to us? We got about 12 or 13 minutes left, but can you talk to us about what are the cultural and political dilemmas to change?
So, the political dilemma is really about your policy frameworks and where the wider policy and standards and things that are being imposed that could be from a governmental level about what policing needs to look like and when it comes to training. So I'm all for standardization, of course, but then we're not building McDonald's, right? So not every cop is going to be the same, not every situation is going to be the same. So there's an element, so the political notion of standardization is good, but it can go too far. So again, you end up with checklists and boxes if you want to standardize, essentially, and you kind of iron out context, you iron out individuality, you iron out those things. So for me, it's a cautionary note around those things, around the standardization of training, which is a wider political thing. Yes, there might be principles that are common, but there are other things. So I've stolen a phrase called structured improvisation, right? So we need to have an overarching structure, but we need to allow people to develop and grow within that structure. So over standardization is an issue, so we're looking at how do we do assessment? How do we do these things? How do we look for evidence for assessment? And we can go too far down that bureaucratic standardization route that it ceases to become useful. So I think that's an example of a political dilemma. So there'll be all of these things. I talk about the unintended consequences of well-intended actions. So people are set out really well-intended, but the unintended consequences, when you start following this through, starts creating dilemmas and putting pressure on the way that people operate. And I guess the cultural piece is around, we talk about police culture, and we can talk about different, a really good example, for example, is around women in the police. And, we talk about some gendered and sexist approaches to, particularly around use of force and approaches to how people are trained. There's that cultural element, the less seemly elements of the police culture, but there's also ideas around what it is to be a trainer. You're the sage on the stage. You're the expert practitioner who everyone listens to. So you're this knowledge holder, and you're the one who gives knowledge. So there's this wider cultural dilemma about what is the role of the trainer, who are they, what do they look like, and what messages do they send through their training. So again, these are issues that are dilemmas that can be an impediment to really good contemporary learning environments.
So on that, you say in your paper here, you said if police safety training is to reculture, the first obstacle is to overcome the experience of the trainers and the learners. And I found that I had to read that several times and reflect on that. So can you unpack that a bit for us?
Well, I don't know how it is in North America, but in England and Wales, certainly a significant portion of police trainers were police officers. And there are civilian trainers who arguably are very often from a military background or have a kind of an adjacent type of experience. But a police officer receiving officer safety training today and having it every year in their renewal for however long before they become a trainer, that's a lot. That's a lot of experience. So they're how training is delivered, what in their mind is good training and bad training, what their experiences look like, is ingrained in them, in their experience as police officers. And suddenly they become a trainer, right? And, across domains, so it's not just in the police, but in sport and in other areas, we basically teach or train or coach how we were trained. That's essentially, that's our fallback position until we can offer something new or enhance that. But even now, the research across education, across a range of domains, people are still drawing on their experience as learners and what they went through as examples of good training or good coaching. So those sorts of experiences, we need to overcome those because, you've gone through a system that probably wasn't optimal. So we need to kind of get you to recognize the influence of that experience on your perception, but then start challenging some of those ideas and replacing some of them with a different approach, really. And it's the same for trainers, right? So the number of times people, I've been doing this 20 years, you can't tell me anything about training, yada, yada, yada. It's like, well, I massively respect your experience and your time. But my question is, very often have you actually got 20 years experience, or is it 1 year's experience 20 times, right?
Very
and
good.
again,
Right.
There's a real difference between those two things. Let's unpack what that means and then start that kind of reculturing piece. Like, well, I massively respect that. But where we are now is it's evidence informed. We want to do these things. And we're back into that first loop again, aren't we, around why the training isn't. So we're kind of trying to drag them into that space of, let me show you something different. Let me show you how we can improve this. Let me show you how we can develop you. So we're all carrying that baggage around, whether, a police officer has received a stack of training before they become a trainer. And we can't ignore that. We can't ignore that and what that's going to mean for their perception and the kind of the screen through which all of this new knowledge will have to pass. And we have to kind of help them recognize that screen and then encourage them to be open-minded and reflective about those things.
So, Professor, there in the UK and Wales, does the College of Policing then so for our listeners internationally outside of your location, does the College of Policing, does it govern all of the training curriculum and standards that's taught?
So it's the professional body for policing in England and Wales. So it sits out. So there are 43 police forces in England and Wales, and technically they're all responsible for their own training. So, so in England and Wales, we used to have a very centralized model. So every force did the same training, and there were training colleges, and you basically did basic training. It was very similar, and it was very standardized. And then we went through a process of federalizing that, so dispersing the resources to individual forces who basically did what they liked. And everything what goes around comes around, right? So we've almost come full circle again, saying, well, actually, we're looking at there's such a mismatch of the amount of time, not only content, but the amount of time we spend training, what we do with new officers, how we deal with certain situations. It's very different across forces. So the College of Policing basically said we need to, and plus the data and the statistics tell us that, the existing training isn't fit for purpose. So the College of Policing, as that national professional body, is bringing it back under their control. So there's a standardized curriculum now. There's parameters for the amount of hours that you should spend training. There's more of a standardized curriculum around the scenarios. So the scenarios are essentially the curriculum, and you then as a police force, you then become licensed by the College of Policing. So you put your trainers on an upskill course. You do train the trainer. You demonstrate to the college that you're a licensed deliverer of their training. So it's not quite centralized, but it's more of a standardization of the training across the forces.
Okay, and so this model that we've been talking about, using scenario-based training, this pedagogy, this gold standard, is it something that right now has the College of Policing adopted this way? Is it currently in process? Is there still more work to be done? Help us understand where is it at, and where do you want it to go?
So it was formally rolled out in April of this year. So it's been adopted as the curriculum and the pedagogical model for police training in England and Wales. So it was formally ratified in April of this year. And forces are slowly coming on board with, I think they've got about another year or so to basically become licensed. So they have to put their trainers through an upskill course. They have to demonstrate that the amount of time they're dedicating to training. They have to show. There's also been an investment in facilities and equipment to kind of create better learning environments. So basically the forces almost demonstrate or prove this, and then they become licensed. They become licensed by the college. So there's no other show in town, unfortunately. So if you want to do something else in England and Wales, you're stuck with this. So it has become adopted as the model. And and as I go around different forces and looking at it, and they're giving it a go. Again, research tells us that when you transition from a more traditional based instructional approach to something that's more scenario based or more complex, reality based, it takes about a year for trainers to get into the groove. And we're in that process, right? So they've started doing it, they're giving it a go. There's some quite common mistakes and things that they're doing. So what you tend to find in scenarios is you end up with people who just put a scenario on and stand and watch it, and just let officers do what they do, and don't really control the things that we've been talking about. And you can't really differentiate the levels. You can't really see the progression. They just put something on and stand and watch it. The other common issue is the fear of this, so almost a stand back. I'll put this on, then I'll do the next thing. I'll do the next thing, and they don't really instruct. They just kind of let the thing have a life of its own. The other common issue is the other way round. So the scenario will be running a minute and they're stopping it, saying you need to do, so they're almost reasserting that overly instructional piece on it, and they haven't quite found the balance between that. For me, it's about reps. So you need to keep repping stuff over and over and over again, so it becomes second nature. And that's really important for the verbal de-escalation skills. You have whatever your model is. You have an initial approach, you have a universal greeting, and then you deal with people. Whatever your model is for that. And because that you do that in every rep, you need to do reps, so it becomes second nature. So whatever, for me, it's again about that cognitive load. So if someone, if I'm engaging with you, Chris, and you start shouting at me and abusing me, I've got a model so ingrained that I already know what I'm going to say to you, and I'm watching your hands, and I'm looking at your body language, and I'm looking at your friend. So my processing, dealing with your verbal nonsense, is so well tuned that I can attend to other things. Whereas if you're struggling to reply to somebody who's shouting and screaming at you and being abusive, you don't really notice the hand, you don't notice this, whatever else is happening. So that takes repetitions, right? So you need to keep the reps over. So what tends to happen is people just run the scenario once rather than having thinner slices of the scenario and doing reps of it. So you get that. So you get the repetition. So you tend to find people stand back and watch or intervene too much. They don't think about thin sliced scenarios and gradually building up the complexity. And of course, we've already talked about the excessive briefing and debriefing. Everyone, there's a few people who work in the job who just like the sound of their own voice. I think they just want to talk incessantly about stuff rather than it's not about you. It's about the learners. Let's just get on with doing reps.
Okay. So if I was to come from a police force there in England to the college to take this upskilled course, what would I be? Is this like a 5-day program?
Yeah, it's 5 days. It's a 5-day program, and basically within the first 10 minutes we're doing a scenario. So everything is scenario based. So we set up, we walk through. I think it would probably start with a stop and search scenario, and we'll just say, right, go up. You've had some information. This person has been seen loitering around cars, matches the description of somebody breaking into vehicles. You need to go and stop and search them. So within 10 minutes, you're walking up to say, my name is Chris Butler. I'm here with whatever police force. They've been report. You match the description of. I need to do this, and we're up and running. So we start walking through the scenarios. But for the trainers, it'll be then let's talk about how we've set this up. So we insert the knowledge when we need it. So we run through an example. So we model it for them and then say, well, why have we done that? And we talk about the difference between performance and learning. We talk about practice design and say, okay, let's see what we've done and how that aligns to practice design. So we insert those theoretical and conceptual pieces as we go. So we'll talk a little bit about performance versus learning and practice design. We'll then talk about scenario-based training and the principles. Again, inserting it, we're going to start, so we, for example, a really simple way of doing it is we've got one cop, one subject. Okay, let's make it harder for the cop. One cop, two subjects. Let's make it easier for the cop. One subject, two cops. So we're now starting to manipulate, starting to add conditions. And we then, again, we'll start layering in that theoretical knowledge as they move through the scenarios, basically. So we'll cover all six. There's 6 scenarios. You cover the 6 scenarios in the first 3 days, and we insert that theoretical knowledge as we go, as it connects to it. And the second 2 days, it's a teach back type of experience. So they start doing like micro teachers, so 1 instructor and 2 learners, and we just build the numbers up. So in the end, by the end of the week, they're taking the whole group on a scenario, basically. So it's practice what you preach, right? It's all the scenario-based training carries the water, so it's all delivered within the scenario. We put add the theoretical content as we go along and connect it to different aspects of the scenario, and then gradually hand the reins over to the instructors and say, right, we're here. Let's have a look at that. and then coach them through. And again, it's really interesting. And I don't know if you have this in North America. It's really interesting to move them away from, like, when you're coaching in a scenario, people tend to move into like assessor mode. So they almost kind of step back with a clipboard, and it's like, well, no, you're an instructor, you're a coach. So help the person. If they're struggling, go in and help them. How you help them, well, we can talk about that, different modes, but it's not wait till the end with your clipboard and say, well, you didn't do that very well. The next time you need to do that. So again, it's been quite interesting moving people into a more coaching, instructional mode as soon as because typically the scenario's at the end and you're standing with your clipboard, aren't you, going, yeah,
Right.
And getting them out of that mode has been quite challenging. So supporting them, delivering in micro, so 2 learners, 1 instructor, and just building the numbers up and just modeling stuff. And again, delivering it as we would to officers, really giving them the learning that they need when they need it.
Sounds like an incredible model, and I'm sure going to serve the officers and the public there in England and Wales very well. We have been going
Hope so.
for 1 hour, Professor. I can't believe how fast our time has gone by. We've been speaking with Professor Chris Cushion on his recent study, Changing Police Personal Safety Training Using Scenario-Based Training, a critical analysis of dilemmas in practice impacting change, that was published in Frontiers in Education. And just as a reminder to all of our listeners, if you go over to the trainersbullpen.com, and we would encourage you to do this, you'll find a copy of this paper appended to the show notes. Please download it and review it. Professor, you mentioned a pending study that you were hoping to be published soon, comparing the linear technique-based model versus the scenario-based model. When do you expect we might be able to see that paper?
Yeah, so I can't mark my own homework. So the College of Policing basically did. So basically there was a pilot force, and they started off with they expanded the number of groups on the new training and reduced the number of groups on the old training, and essentially basically followed those officers as the training changed, and then they monitored lots of KPIs, so perceptions of the officers around the training, but also their interactions with the public, injuries, complaints, use of force. All of that data has been, and it's quite a nice model that they've used to evaluate it. Now, I know that they have the data. I think it's in or been through peer review, so I think it's imminent. So I'm happy to share. Would be happy to share the link once it's out, and you can have a look at the impact of the training, and real meaningful difference to interactions with the public on the street, so less complaints, less injuries, yet less, more considered use of force. All of those things were, as I said to you earlier, if I'd have paid for the data, I couldn't have structured it better. It's a really positive outcome, from actual end user use, not just perceptions of training and police officers feeling that the training's good. It's actually making their job easier, and seeing all the, the statistics and data going in the right way for use of force and interactions with the public.
Right.
So,
well, and the proof is in the pudding, as you like to
absolutely
say there. Right. Professor, how can our listeners, if they want to reach out to you, contact you, ask questions, what would be the preferred method of them get in touch with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn at Coach C1. Sorry, on X on at Coach C1. I'm on LinkedIn with that's how we got in touch, Chris, isn't it? On LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn as me, but I'm also happy to take. If people Google me at the university, they'll see my email. So I'm happy to take questions and support in any way. Just to whatever people need to ask or about the approach or the research. Happy to answer any questions. Not a problem at all.
Fantastic. Professor, thanks again for your time, and we would look forward to having you back on again once your pending paper is released and talk about that.
Yeah, it'd be great to talk about some of the data and how it's used. And again, I'm collecting data on this as I go along, really, particularly around the change in trainers and how people feel before and after the training as trainers, and it's fascinating to see the change in body language. So day one, everyone sat there with their arms folded and incredibly skeptical. Right. But then, by day 5, they're delivering scenario-based training and going, why have I not been doing this? What have I been doing for the last 20 years? Where has this been, kind of thing? So, it's been incredibly rewarding in that sense to see people enjoy it and see the benefits of it in that way, really.
Fantastic. Professor, thanks for your time.
Pleasure. Great to chat.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Trainer's Bullpen. And as always, our encouragement to you is that you would reflect deeply about the critical aspects of this interview and how you can apply the principles that you heard to advance your training and make your students more effective and adaptive performers in the real world. As a reminder, all of the research papers, as well as the other links, are available to you over at the Trainer's Bullpen website at trainersbullpen.com. Thank you for your dedication to advancing officer and public safety.